Jason, I want to start with you. You're a Washington native.
Yes.
And you loved weather from a young age. So I'm originally from Illinois, from the Chicago area.
Yep.
So when people move to Washington, they're always saying, you know, Washingtonians are sissies when it comes to weather. So as a native Washingtonian, are we really sissies here, or what's the deal?
You know, I just wrote a piece on this a couple weeks ago after a writer in our newsroom who is from Minnesota claimed that, you know, we need to get back in school. This was just a couple of days after the big blizzard, Snowzilla. And she was saying that in Minnesota, they would have been back in school the next day. And I said, you know, you have to look at our area. You have to look at our vulnerability. You have to look at our demographics. We have a lot of people who come into the area who have no experience with snow whatsoever. They're from the South. Maybe they're from another country, Latin America, where it doesn't snow. So you have a big mix of people. It's a very dense infrastructure. And obviously, it just takes a little bit of snow, as we know, in this region to cause a lot of problems, much less 2 feet of it. So I think there are a lot of different factors which ultimately make this area somewhat vulnerable compared to areas farther north. Now, if you look at Atlanta relative to DC, I mean, they'll shut down for even lesser snow than we will here. So, Angela, you have anything to add? I mean, you've been...
Yes, well,
you're from Cleveland.
I'm from Northeast Ohio, so I have an even more different perspective than you do. But I mean, you also recently wrote that we're experiencing more large snowstorms than we have in the past too, and I think that this is something that maybe if we realize that we're uniquely vulnerable, we can make preparations and we can invest more in our snow removal technology maybe, and we can actually
more trucks.
More trucks and more salt, right? Maybe we can actually do a little bit more to prepare for next season, and I don't know if I see that happening, and maybe we can just do a little bit more, and so we don't get stuck out in the snow so much. That's my perspective.
Angela, your focus has been on climate change and the study of it, so when we're talking about politics especially, can you tell us definitively about climate change?
There are some things we can say definitively about climate change, and then there are a lot of things that we still can't say definitively about climate change.
If you were advising a presidential candidate, what would you tell them about climate change?
Oh, I would tell them that it's absolutely happening, and it's something that we need to be considering across all of the things that we consider at this point, because it's a huge risk. And so we need to be thinking about it in everything that we do, and from snow to heat waves to drought, it's impacting our weather, absolutely.
Well, I want to remind our studio audience, you're part of this conversation, so if you have a question, raise your hand and we'll get a mic to you as quickly as possible. So let's talk about naming of storms. What makes the perfect name for the Weather Gang?
Sure, I'll start with this. I think, first of all, we don't name every storm. We only name the big ones.
So you're not like, the Weather Channel, who's just like any sort of weather event.
Yeah,
Am I being harsh? I feel like I'm a little harsh today.
I don't know. I mean, maybe it's deserved. But I think we choose to name a storm when we think it's going to be historic, of great significance, a top 10, top 15 type event. And when we see that type of event is coming and we're confident, we have to have a certain degree of confidence. Otherwise, it's going to look silly if we name a storm which fizzles out, and that's happened once. But fortunately, that particular storm had kind of a fitting name. It was called the Snowquester of March 6, 2013. We were forecasting 5 to 10 inches of snow, and there was bare ground downtown, and the federal government shut down. Anyways, it was just too good of a name, and our readers had recommended it prior to the storm, and it looked like the storm had the potential to maybe be a big one, but then it just turned out not to be cold enough. So
we call that a bust.
We call that right. But in most cases, Snowzilla, Snowmageddon, Commutageddon, the ones which are high impact storms, which people will remember for a long time. Those are the ones we name, and we don't name them. We ask our readers for recommendations, then we kind of select the ones which seem to be resonating the most. We put them up for a vote on our blog, and we get thousands of people voting on this. And Snowzilla emerged this time, and we'll see what the next storm is named.
So, go ahead.
I was just going to say, people have been naming snowstorms for centuries, right? The Knickerbocker storm, for example, the blizzard of President's Day storm, for example. I mean, we name our big storms, right? Because we want to remember them. And so naming winter storms is something that people have always done. So the Weather Channel hasn't really invented something new. They've invented something new, I think, for social media and for storm tracking in naming every single winter storm. But for us, we want people to be able to kind of like circle around something familiar and something that people can be proud of and say, we survived something big,
We have survived.
Yes.
So we have a question from an audience member. Go ahead.
Hi. This is actually a question on behalf of my mom.
Oh, so this is
flew
her mom
out
who flew in specially for this event.
Yes.
Hello.
For
From
just,
Colorado.
not for her daughter, for you guys.
It's
Wow,
great to see
thanks
you.
so much.
So she reads the Washington Post every day and is always calling me from Colorado to say, why aren't you going to work today? Like, it's
Yes.
what's happening. And in addition to like the infrastructure and the lack of trucks and people commuting in, is there something meteorologically different about snow here? Because I know like growing up in Colorado, our snow was super fluffy and it would melt the next day. It doesn't do that here. So what meteorologically makes snow here different, or climate-wise makes it stick more?
Right. I'll take this, and then Angela can weigh in as well. So our snow tends to be a heavier, wetter snow here. It has a higher moisture content. The snow in out west is, as you mentioned, it's a drier or a fluffier snow. And for example, typically like 1 inch of rain in DC, a storm which would produce 1 inch of rain produces about 10 inches of snow. The type of snow you get out west, an inch of rain, the equivalent would be 20, maybe 30 inches of snow. So you get a lot more snow for every increment of rain because it's a drier snow, it's a colder snow. So here, yes, our snow is wetter, and what also tends to happen is we sometimes will be kind of warm-headed into a storm and it'll be above freezing, and then once the snow starts, it'll drop below freezing. So the snow kind of melts on that warm surface, but then it refreezes as the snow picks up in intensity, the temperature drops. So you get this icy layer underneath the snow which is falling, which I think makes it harder to drive on. I spent a couple years in Madison, Wisconsin in graduate school, and the snow there was more powdery, drier, and it tended to it would accumulate on the roads, but people would just drive on it. It was slick, but it was still, it wasn't quite as icy as the surfaces here tend to be.
Yeah, I agree with that. And and it's the same in Northeast Ohio too. We're very familiar with snow. Pretty much every winter storm that comes through, we know we're going to get snow, and we have ice trucks or salt trucks that come out and take care of our roads. But here, I think just because of our region, it's also very difficult to forecast because of the specific location between the Atlantic Ocean and the Appalachian Mountains. Our air mass is a little bit different. It's a very difficult location along the I-95 corridor to forecast, and so that's another reason why I think people are so hesitant to invest in more preparation techniques, because sometimes we get it wrong. And we do get it wrong. We do have our bus, for sure.
Kevin, this last big snowstorm, I took some beautiful photos of my child sledding. They're either too blue, or when I correct them, they're like white and muddy. How do we take the perfect photo of our kid in snow?
So the cameras actually do a fairly good job. I always take it into Photoshop and color balance. And
Okay, so for those of us who can't do that, maybe.
yeah, and there's a lot of tools out there in the market that you can use, very similar to Photoshop. And there's ways you can adjust the color and level, balance. You can tweak the colors. So if you get a certain blue hue, I always get sort of a blue haze to a lot of my photos, and I'll just kind of remove it with a little dial in Photoshop, make it nice and clear.
So it's better to not be so blue, because I also think that when I'm like sort of,
And
I don't know what I should be looking at. Like, should it be that bright white, or?
Well, from a photographer's point of view, you don't want the snow bleached. You want to have at least some gray texture. You want to be able to see the crystalline structure, the little drifts, the lines. So you don't want to overexpose. But I was going to mention, some of the smartphones now with their software will actually do a lot of this for you. You can actually, on the phone, start changing the colors, or in the software itself, when it takes the photos, it'll try to pull the blues out for you. So you'll find you can actually take some fairly good photos with your phone these days, the newer ones.
How do you tell the story about weather? Because we all like the scientific things, like, should I wear a coat? How much is it going to snow? Should I go and get bread and milk? But how do you actually turn weather into a story with what you guys do?
Well, I think that, and the reason why there are so many people here is because weather is interesting to all of us, and it's an interesting story to tell because it affects everybody's life so perfectly, right? it's part of our life every day. We have to get up every morning and decide what we're going to wear and decide if we're going to put that hat on. And so everyone is especially interested in the weather, and so that makes it very easy to tell a story about the weather because everyone's very interested in it. And then we take those interests and say, well, you know, there's a thunderstorm coming, or we have a chance of thunderstorms today, and then we can translate that forecast into both a scientifically interesting story, but also kind of like a risk forecast, you know, and that's really what we try and get down to is this going to be a severe thunderstorm? Is it going to be a garden variety thunderstorm? Is this something I'm going to have to, you know, prepare my children for? Is it something that I need to leave work early for? Things like that. And so that's really what we do on a day-to-day basis. And then, you know, things that, you know, Kevin gets into is more of like, you know, making things very interesting, you know, photos and
the people, the aspects.
And the people. When he gets out and taking photos and meeting tourists, and that's what really makes it interesting is interacting with the people.
Yeah, we had a little bit on snow kiters. I've never seen it before. In the Washington Monument, guys with big kites and skis were going 20, 30 feet in the air off the Washington Monument Hill. And so we ran an article on that.
The kayakers?
The kayakers in the
Yes.
snow, the kayakers climbing the rocks in the rain, we've done that. We did a story on an igloo. Some kid built a 3-room igloo with a sound system and lighting, and we did a whole article on that. It was very, very interesting.
What ended up happening with that story?
Oh, guys, so what ultimately happened with the story was very interesting. It actually made the Washington Post afternoon buzz, which I always love when one of my stories jumps out of our blog into the mainstream. And the igloo was cool. I mean, it really was. It had 3 rooms. It was huge. It took the kids' backyard. NBC4 ran with it. They took the content and the photos and put it on their website. And we were looking for the credit lines. I called the family. Hey, did they call you? They just ran with our story.
Well, it was a very cool story.
Yeah.
At a Washington Nationals room, a
shrine to the Washington
shrine
Capitals.
To the Washington Capitals,
Yeah.
right, yeah.
With flags and pucks.
And hockey pucks, yeah.
If I could just add one point about one of the real points of emphasis on our blog is it's helping people make decisions. And we really stress communicating forecast uncertainty. That is, explaining what the whole universe of possible scenarios is and what the likelihood of a worst case scenario or a best case scenario and what the most likely scenario is. We try to kind of set up goalposts so people understand what the range of possibilities are, and that's really helpful for planning. You know, weather forecasting is uncertain. We don't always get it right, but we don't want people to be totally caught off guard, so we want them to understand, you know, if something goes wrong with a forecast, what is it going to look like outside? And we try our best to do that. And I think that's, over time, what's helped kind of define us and set us apart from, you know, your traditional 3-minute weathercast, where they frankly don't have time to get into that level of detail. But that's where sort of a blog format, where we can write 750 words in a weather story to explain, you know, all of the different possibilities and discuss what the different models are saying. People really geek out to models. They like they want to know what the GFS model is saying. They want to know what the European model is saying. So I think that's kind of what has made us a little bit unique over time.
What's your pet peeve when it comes to your industry?
Pet peeves.
This is a safe space.
Sure.
And it's not that he doesn't have one, he's just trying to pick one.
Right. Do you hate like the people in the storm, like it's terrible out there?
Yeah, I think an issue which has come up lately is, you know, some people, they will hype forecasts and they'll take, you know, we have computer model forecasts which go out, you know, 10, 14, 16 days into the future. And frankly, weather forecasts, the limit of predictability of an accurate forecast is typically between about 5 and 8 days. But you'll see weather hobbyists who may not know any better, you know, and I'm not trying to demonize anybody here, but they'll put up on Facebook, you know, oh my gosh, we're gonna get 2 feet in 10 days, and those models have absolutely no skill that day. I mean, you may as well throw darts at a board, and you'll be you could produce good a forecast. So I think that's a process of education. We have to educate the consumer on what the limits of weather forecasting are. So when they see some of these forecasts which go up on Facebook and get shared 10,000 times because people go, oh my God, we're going to have 2 feet in 10 days. I mean, we're just not at the point where weather forecasts are that good. And you probably have other pet peeves, Angela.
I mean, the first thing I thought was forecasts that don't attach any uncertainty to them. Forecasts that say, you know, it is going to be this temperature or it is going to do this on this day without saying, you know, qualifying it with, oh, and by the way, I'm not really sure, you know, and oh, and by the way, the weather pattern is such that, you know, this is a really low confidence forecast. And something that we do, and Jason was talking about, is that, you know, if we're putting out a forecast for next Wednesday and the weather and the models are all over the place and the pattern is very tricky, we're going to say, listen, here's our forecast, but take this with a huge grain of salt and make sure that your plans are such that they're flexible and you can change them, because we don't really know at this point, and this might be kind of a game time decision thing. So I really like to see forecasts have that uncertainty attached to them.
Kevin, pet peeves?
Yeah, so I don't like in the middle of a snowstorm or storm in general, our readers will start calling for a busted forecast. And it's way premature. I've seen that a number of times, and ultimately our forecasts will come out and be correct. But they're hyping and getting sort of a little excited, thinking that the forecast is not going to pan out the way they think, and they're very vocal on our comments.
Well, it happened in Snowzilla, right? Because if you were in downtown DC during Snowzilla, it kind of stopped snowing a little bit on Saturday morning, right? We had the dry air slack come in on Saturday morning, where Frederick was still getting hammered with snow, but downtown DC it stopped snowing, and everyone was like, "Oh, it's a bust! Oh, it's a bust!" And we were like, "No, really, it's going to start snowing again." And sure enough, you know, mid-afternoon it picked up and we started getting blizzard conditions, and then everything started to kind of fall in line again. But that's kind of what Kevin's referring to.
Yes, exactly.
You just gotta wait for it to play out. We promise it'll play out the way you expect it to.
Excellent. We have a question from an audience member. Go ahead.
So I'm a high school counselor here in DCPS, and I grew up in Pittsburgh, so I certainly 10 years ago was of the mindset that Washingtonians are pansies. I no longer have that feeling. But as you guys are probably aware from the comments on Twitter and Facebook, DC educators are huge fans of Capital Weather Gang. In fact, one of my friends at school gets into very heated arguments with a colleague that dares to bring up a network news forecast, and she'll be like, "Oh no, Jason said this," or whatever. But we are dying to know what happened to the apples and the Capitol domes. Schoolcast is like our Bible, and you've taken away the fun.
Okay.
That was his call. I'm
That's-
gonna let him
yeah.
handle that.
Right. So I think what we've kind of reworked Schoolcast a little bit, so we give the percent chance of a delay or a percent chance of closing for every single county in the immediate area. And we're just trying to provide more specific information and give people more of a quantitative sense of what's going to happen, whereas the apples were just kind of, it was like 1, 2, 3, or 4 apples and a little bit imprecise. So we're just trying to give people more specific information. Now, having said that, I've thought about trying to bring the apples back as part, and incorporate them with the percentages somehow. So I'm thinking through it. So if we hear you, and we'll try to bring them back. We'll try to bring them back.
We like those too. The apples.
So you want both? We can do that. We'll work on that.
You like
Thank you.
graphics. You guys do like graphics.
Absolutely, yeah. Visuals are a great way to communicate.
We have another question over here.
Big fan of the blog, the Capital Weather Gang, and it's related to this. So I love the red light, yellow light, green light system for all the different systems, and I'm wondering if you can be brutally honest and frank in your assessments of how the different school systems and governments around here respond and their freak out or not freak out over closing or not closing. And names would be great.
You want me to?
What are you looking at me for?
You can both answer.
You're the
Okay,
one
I
who's been here forever.
I know. I just don't want to hog the stage here. But I was, yeah. I think we've met with some county officials for certain school systems, to get a better understanding of their decision process. And they're in a very difficult position. It's kind of they're damned if they do, damned if they don't when they're opening and closing school. And they're having to deal with uncertain forecast information. And there are certain cases where it's a very easy decision to open or close school. There are other situations where it's more difficult. And the way the Weather Service does briefings for school systems, for the various government officials, for emergency managers, for everyone who has a stake in the weather. They do like a 3 or 4 a.m. conference call. So school systems can dial in, they can get this information, and then they have to make a decision based on the Weather Service briefing. Now, we know that the Weather Service the schools aren't just looking at the Weather Service forecast, they're looking at the media forecast. They look at what we're forecasting, and I think in most cases they make pretty good calls. There have been exceptions. Over the course of years. I hammered Fairfax County once, and some people agreed with me. Some people thought I was being way too hard. And there have been other cases. There was one early January last year where they decided it was cold, it was snowing. It was in early January, and I guess there were forecasts out there for maybe dusting to a couple of inches, and they just kind of assumed that the snow amounts were going to be at the low end of estimates, but it ended up being more like 2 to 3 inches, and it really backfired because it was a very difficult commute that morning. I think it was January 6, 2015. And we basically said the school's goofed. When you have cold temperatures, they're sub-freezing, the roads are cold, and you have snow moving in at the commute, you can't be putting the school buses out there. This area is just too vulnerable in that situation.
Yeah, I will say that the counties that appear to be making poor decisions tend to be the counties that have a very broad range of circumstances in elevation, particularly, and weather scenarios. So Montgomery and Fairfax tend to be our two big like gray area zones. Montgomery and Fairfax have these, big elevation changes, and they have kids coming in from all these different areas and being bused to all these different areas. And the decision usually has to be made at 4 a.m. or some ridiculous time. And depending on exactly when the first flakes fall, it's an impossible decision. And so usually what happens is more often than not they close, right? But then you get into these situations where they feel pressure to stay open because they've closed so much, and then they end up putting people at risk. And so it's really kind of a lose-lose in a lot of cases. And so based on the conversations we've had over the past year, we're starting to feel kind of bad for these guys because they really have a kind of a nightmare job. Yeah.
Let me just add one more point about geography, which is if you look at Montgomery County, the weather in Damascus, Maryland, elevation, they're 800 feet. It's like the mountains up there. It is completely different from Chevy Chase. And so they might be getting 4 to 8 inches of snow in Damascus, and it might be not accumulating at all in Chevy Chase. There's tremendous variation. And so the county has to take that into account because they've got roads there which are, very in the western and northern part of Montgomery County, which are just, it's like a totally different climate up there. And I think that's a big challenge in Montgomery County and in Fairfax County as well, because Kevin, he lives in the westernmost part of Fairfax County in Oakton, but the weather in Alexandria, near the Potomac River is totally different.
And Prince William is similar. They go from the sea level all the way to the Bull Run Mountains in one county.
Yep.
So it's wildly different weather conditions. And we just experienced in the last few days one of those storms where I think Damascus had 6 inches.
Yep.
Right.
And it was a coating of snow down in Chevy Chase.
Yep.
So
2 more questions. There's a question right here. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I've been a fan of your site and your blog for many years, and I thank you for all you do, especially covering weather from other parts of the world and issues of climate change and so on. And I appreciate that. My question, though, is about the models to which you've already made reference. Basically, how do these work, and what is your relationship with the models? I get the sense that the models have lives of their own, and you sort of pick bits out, not bits, but you pick your models and you analyze them and so on. And I'm just wondering, on what basis do you make these analyses and comparisons? The models exist and they're spat out by satellites, machines, I'm not quite sure how, and maybe you tell us how they work. But then do you bring your own knowledge and experience onto the models to produce your own like human-developed forecasts?
Let you start.
Yeah, so forecast models were developed, you know, they started to become developed right after, you know, weather forecasting was developed. And the first models were, you know, as soon as we got equations that we knew governed the atmosphere, we started to plug those equations into computers to try and model the atmosphere. And so that's really where computer models come from. And so there are hundreds of computer models running out there that are trying to model the atmosphere. We have probably, I'd say, you know, between 5 and 10 that we like to go to that are trusted now that we use. Some are old still and we don't really trust them that much, and some are very good. The European is a very good forecast model. It has very good equations, it has very good physics and very advanced physics, and it has a very, it's run on a very honkin' computer, which helps too. The GFS is another one. It has very advanced physics, and it also is about to be upgraded to a very honking computer.
These are technical terms.
These are
Yes.
very, this is how they describe their computers, honking. And so they are actually being run by the government in most cases. There are some universities that also run their own models and things like that, but usually in most cases it's government-run organizations. And then in our case, in the U.S. government's case, you can access this model data for free, which is why websites post model data on them, and that's how we get them. You can also go to NOAA.gov and get the model data. The Europeans have taken a different approach and are charging for that model data, which is why it's a little bit more difficult to get access to it. And so we pay subscriptions to get access to that data, and so does the US government. They're paying the Europeans to get access to that data. The data that's fed into the models is from everywhere. The World Meteorological Organization controls that data and makes sure that everyone has that data so that you know, the models can have access to it, and that, you know, the models know what the atmosphere is currently doing, so it can run forward and we can have a forecast. And what else? Yeah.
And then
so-
How do we decide which one to use? Yeah, I mean, so I mean, that just comes down to experience and understanding the various, some different models have different biases. Some might be too warm in certain situations, some might be too cold, it's too wet, too dry. And so as a forecaster, you learn what those biases are and you take those into account when you're making forecasts. And, you know, you have trusted go-to models. And, you know, I think for me, and I think it probably holds true for Angela and probably most forecasters right now, just because the European model is the most skillful. It's what we maybe look at first, but it's much smarter not to just look at one model, but to look at kind of the universe of model simulations which are out there, sort of more of what we call an ensemble forecast approach. So you can because then you can kind of see what the whole range of possibilities are, and you can see where there's consensus, where models are in agreement, and that's what helps you build confidence in a forecast, is when the models are in agreement. And what was unique about the Snowzilla storm at the end of January was that all of the models told a very similar story, that we were going to get crushed. And so that meant we had high confidence in our forecast.
Another question here.
First off, thank you all. This is crazy work that you did. I don't envy you. But as an educator, I do want to thank you for those busts, because they make for very productive days. But I am curious, in that same vein, and it's sort of along the lines of what you were just describing, how have those busts help you to enhance your work? You know, the mistakes that help us grow. Where are some that you've had those experiences and then your work has become better because of it?
Great question.
I can start. Yeah, so I think, you know, one of our most monumental busts was that March 6, 2013 storm called the Snowquester. And, you know, I think we got a little bit overconfident. We saw some of the models putting out big numbers, and there were some which were a little bit more cautious, and we kind of, I don't know, I think there was some groupthink going on. I think the Weather Service, all the various media organizations, we all just kind of focused more on the high-end results, and we didn't do a really good job at communicating the range of possibilities. And I think, you know, after that we had the experience with that storm, and there was a lot of backlash. You know, it was, we had a lot of 4-letter words thrown at us that day, and
If you remember the storm, Jim Cantore was on the mall, on the National Mall, and there's no snow falling. You know, the Weather Channel's expecting this huge blizzard, and Jim Cantore's in the mall, and there's nothing happening. It was so embarrassing. And that's the thing. It wasn't just the Capitol Weather Gang. It was everybody. It was like enterprise-wide, weather enterprise-wide.
Yeah.
It was a bust for everybody. So.
yeah, and so after that storm, we instituted what we call our boom and bust scenarios for every snow forecast. The boom being what's the percentage that the chance the storm will exceed our most likely snowfall, and the bust is what's the percentage chance that the snowfall will be less than our most likely snowfall. And I think that's helped people. I mean, just this past week, we were right on the edge of getting accumulating snow and not getting accumulating snow. And we talked about how places well north and west of DC got 2 to 4 inches, but in the city it was mostly rain. And we had called for a coating to 2 inches in the city, whereas it turned into mostly a rainstorm. But we did say that there was a 25% chance of no accumulation. So therefore, people knew there was a legitimate, a 1 in 4 chance that this was going to be no big deal. And so people weren't shocked when they woke up to bare ground. And so I think that storm, where we really blew it by getting overconfident and putting out numbers which were too big without qualifying that. I think we learned a lot from that, and we try to learn from every storm. We do every snowstorm. We kind of do a post-storm assessment or evaluation, and we talk about what we did well and what we missed. And so we're always trying to learn and get better.
So when we hear you on WTOP, or in my case on NPR as I'm driving in the morning, how can we all start speaking like weather men and do that pattern that you guys do and ladies do so well? It always sounds so good, and where do you get that from, and how do you learn that?
You mean the broadcast?
The broadcast, yeah, it's that thing, that weatherman
We learn it from our forefathers. We learn it from listening to every weatherman that has come before us, right?
Okay, so give us a little bit of what the weather's going to be like today, Angela. We're going to Angela now at the Newseum. What's the weather going to be like today, Angela?
You're on the spot now.
We have partly cloudy skies, and it's going to be cold out there. It doesn't matter if you're going to see sun. We have highs in the teens, and wind chills will be in the single digits through the day. Wind gusts 35 miles per hour. It is cold, so bundle up, bring out the parkas, bring out the hats, stay indoors if you can, because coldest weather of the season this weekend. For the Capitol Weather Gang, I'm Angela Fritz.
Nice. Do you have like a little kind of nod that you like putting in that's your own little piece of spice when you do those?
I probably have patterns. I probably have things that I say over and over again, but I haven't chosen a specific thing that I like to say yet. I always like to, in the big events, when something big is coming, I always like to direct people to where they can find more information, because I feel like I only have 30 to 40 seconds to tell people what the forecast is going to be, and I really want 5 minutes. So I'll always tell people, follow us on Twitter, because that's really where you can find all of our information, and things like that. So that's usually what I'll do.
Kevin, where are you going to be taking photos this week and weekend?
So I'm looking at Monday. We're having a storm move in, and it should start as snow. We don't know how heavy the snow will be, but I want to go down to the tidal basin. It's going to be frozen with all our cold weather, and I want to get a shot of the Jefferson with snow coming down, dusting on the ice. And I do a calendar every year, and we talk about it on our blog. And I always go for a photo from the month of the year before. So I need a photo for February with snow. So I'm counting on it to snow Monday so I can get my February snow photo into the Jefferson.
Well, let's go live to Jason Samenow to find out what this weekend's going to be like. What is that big storm going to be? Are we going to have a snowstorm? And what's the name going to be?
Okay, this is not going to be a named storm. This is not one which is going to go down in the record books. This is happening on President's Day, but this is not President's Day storm 1979, which dropped close to 20 inches. It's not President's Day 2003. This is a mixed bag of precipitation. Should start as snow. We're looking at maybe 1 to 3 inches or so, the way the data is coming in right now. The thing is, though, is that it's going to change to a nasty mix of ice, and then potentially, as the night wears on Monday night, should turn over to all rain, assuming that southerly wind flow is able to scour out the cold air, which doesn't always happen in these situations. So this is a forecast you want to keep a close eye on, and stay tuned to the Capitol Weather Gang for the latest.
Excellent. Thank you so much to the Capitol Weather Gang. This is just part of the gang. How many folks are in the entire gang?
Oh gosh, we've got about 15 contributors.
Excellent. Well,
Yep.
thank you for the work that you do. You clearly have lots of fans from all over the world. Thank you for coming to the Newseum today and telling us not only what the weather's going to be like today, but going into the future. Thank you so much. And thank you to our studio audience for your great questions. We'll see you next time on Inside Media here at the Newseum.